Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another video from JP Tech. In this video we're going to go ahead and get into the build phase of the family member Ryzen / Radeon system build. In this video I'm going to build the system and discuss some things along the way that might be, something you guys already know or something that you find beneficial. So let's go ahead and get into this excellent mainstream AMD build. Alright guys, here we go. We got our empty used S340 Elite case, white, with tempered glass, and we have all the build parts that I discussed in the previous video. So in this video we're going to go ahead and put these parts in this case. Let's go ahead and get to it. Alright guys, for the first step of this build, obviously we got to get this window out of our way because there are no parts going in with this window in our way. Alright, take this tempered glass window and put it somewhere safe. Alright, we're going to break out the data vac so I can give this thing a quick cleaning before I go ahead and put all this hardware in here. Alright, now we're going to take off the back panel because we're most definitely going to need this off to install the new hardware. Alright, so we're going to continue dusting. Alright guys, one thing that I always like to do is make sure that these motherboard standoffs right here are fastened into the tray of the case. If these standoffs aren't tight enough, what ends up happening is you go to remove the motherboard and you go to remove your screws and it starts unscrewing these little risers and they're underneath the motherboard, so it can just be a real pain in the butt. You end up taking the riser out with the motherboard and it's just a hassle. So make sure they're snug, but just use caution that you don't over tighten them and ruin the screw hole. Alright guys, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the motherboard. Here you can see we're using the Asus X370 Strix. On most boards, with the exception of some of the higher end Asus boards that already have like a complete I/O panel where you don't need this, it's already basically on the motherboard itself. You got to make sure that you install this, and you want to install it in the right orientation, which usually the audio is on the bottom, but you can just match it up with the motherboard and figure it out from there. And these usually just always snap in place. Shouldn't take much effort. Once you have that in place, you are ready to go ahead and install the motherboard. And with the motherboard, see, this case is a little bit tighter, but not too big of a deal. You just want to guide it into the rear I/O plate. And then you're going to look at the back, make sure it lines up. And on this particular, what do we have in the way here? Alright, so we got our motherboard lined up. So when you're putting the motherboard in, you want to make sure the rear I/O plate lines up and that the motherboard falls into this position right here. Sometimes this will take a little bit of finagling, but it usually goes into place pretty nicely. Now, what I typically do is I put the memory in before I put the motherboard in, but it really doesn't matter. It just depends on how much space you have and what order you want to do it in. It's not really that significant. Another thing I usually do as well is go ahead and put the processor in the socket as well, but for this video I'm not doing that. It really doesn't matter. It's just, whatever preference you have. Alright guys, so we are putting in the screws to the motherboard. This is going to make sure that the motherboard stays in. There's also some grounding that goes on through the motherboard and the chassis when you fasten it to the chassis. So these you want in nice and snug. They don't need to be over tightened. But this ATX board right here has 3 rows of screws. Well, actually this metal one's just a guide pin, as I discussed. And one thing I generally like to do as well on these system builds is put the screws in the hardest to get locations first where you might lose a screw, because I've actually had to take a motherboard out before because a screw falls somewhere. So I didn't do that this time, so I'm just hoping that doesn't happen. And lastly, it's usually a pretty good idea to make sure that you don't tighten the screws all the way at first, and that you go around and tighten them up afterwards. That allows everything to line up nicely. Alright, so once you have all your screws in, you want to go back and make sure that they're all snug, not tight. And that completes installing the motherboard. We're going to go ahead and take our Ryzen 2600 and install it with the arrow facing the mark on the slot. You do want to remember that this is a 0 insertion force processor socket setup here, so the processor just falls into the socket. You do not push it, as you're more than likely to damage something. But once you drop it in, you want to make sure that it's seated all the way around, and once you know it's seated all the way around, go ahead and lock the lever down. Now when you're installing your DDR4 memory, we're using the Trident's RGB DDR4 3200 CAS16 181838 memory. This is the Hynix stuff. Really good value on this memory. You know, you can spend more on memory and squeeze out more performance potentially on this system depending on what you're doing, but this strikes a good balance of performance and value. There's a long side and a short side to DDR4 memory, and you want to make sure that you're putting the appropriate side in the slot, right? So I'm pushing in the bottom side that doesn't have a latch first, and then I'm pushing in the top side that does have a latch, and then I just kind of make sure that it's seated in there well. Now, pretty much almost always, at least every system that I've built in the last long while really, you stagger the memory for dual channel. And your motherboard will typically say right near the slot, if there's any specific rules, there's a DIMM name down here. This one is A1 and this one is B1, and usually the ones go together, so A and B on the 1 channel and A and B on the 2 channel. So dual channel, and if you add another set, they would stagger these sticks and they would be dual channel as well. It's very important that you pay attention to how you install your memory, because if you put these sticks next to each other, either on these two or these two, you're pretty much going to end up with single channel memory, and depending on what you're doing with the system, it could dramatically hurt performance, and that's just a big no-no. And I see people do it all the time, and it happens. You know, it happens to the best of us. We make mistakes, but if you're installing DDR4 in your system, this is how you're going to want it installed. And sometimes, I know on my X470 Asus Hero motherboard, there's actually asterisks next to the 2 slots that it wants me to use first. And it's important that if you have a system that indicates 2 slots that it wants you to use, that you use those slots, because there is some functionality that you could lose on the board, as with the case of the X470 Hero, if you don't use the slots that they want you to use first. Alright guys, so what we're actually going to try to do here for aesthetic purposes is we're going to try to clock this fan so that the AMD logo is nicely positioned at the top of the motherboard and that it's not mounted on there sideways. Because as it comes, it's going to be sideways. Okay, so as you can see, that's how this is going to go on the motherboard. And what we want to do is take this from this position and turn it to this position. And it looks like they did design it as such that you can change it to line up. Alright guys, so man, I'm just going to keep touching this thermal pad, I guess. Careful not to touch the thermal pad as I did. Okay, as you can see, we got this fan clocked around the right way so that aesthetically it's accurate, it's what we want. The fan cord will come out at the top so we can hide it, and it can plug in where it needs to on the motherboard to the fan header. But as you'll notice, the motherboard already comes equipped with brackets here, and these brackets are for coolers that have the latches, the arms that connect here and snap down here, and then there'll be a lever like on the Wraith Prism. That cooler is like that. So for this application here, what we actually need to do is take these two mounts off, but this cooler will use the stock plate, back plate that comes with the motherboard. It just screws into that same plate. For this stage, what we need to do is carefully unfasten these screws. I do have the back of this case open right now, which is allowing me to get my hand back there and hold the back plate, which doesn't really need to be held right now, of course, but it will be here soon. Another thing too, you want to pay attention to this in the first place, because if your case doesn't have an opening, most do these days, but if you don't have an opening in the back of the motherboard, or the back of the sheet metal behind the motherboard, you're going to have some issues trying to do this once the motherboard is in the case. So this might be something that you might want to set up before. Again, a lot of times I put most of this stuff on the motherboard before I put it into the system. I just have kind of preferred that over the years, especially with these little air coolers like this. I'll just go ahead and put the air cooler on and everything, because it's just a lot easier to put the stuff on outside of the case most of the time. You know, all depending on, you know, the cooler and the setup, of course. Like, I won't pre-install a water cooler, an AIO water cooler that is, because that just doesn't make sense. Alright, so with the way this cooler is designed and the way this backplate is, you gotta hold the backplate in and set this cooler on top of the screw holes, like so. We'll set our power cord out of the way, and what we want to do is go ahead and just get each corner started. Once you have the screws started, you can go around and tighten them up. What you want to do is go around and tighten these up very proportionately, and they're gonna stop. Once they stop, you don't keep turning. They stop where they need to stop for a reason. And anything beyond that, you're not doing it any favors at all. Alright guys, so we have our cooler nice and snug as we want it. Before we forget, we're going to go ahead and plug CPU fan header. Go ahead and line up those pins. Pop that guy on there. we're going to tuck this wire behind the motherboard tray a little bit later on, but for now it's okay there. Alright guys, it's a little bit later in the day now. I had to take a break from this. I had some things I had to get done, but now I'm back. I'm here working on the build. Next thing we're going to go ahead and put in, we're going to connect some of our, let's move this. We're going to connect some of our USB headers and audio front panel stuff down there before we put in the video card, just because I think it's going to make things a little bit easier. It really doesn't matter when you do it, just that you end up doing it. Alright, so we are going to line up this USB port right here. Plug that into the bottom of the board. This is the USB 3 front panel. I really don't like the way they do these connectors, because on many of my motherboards the USB 3 connector is down here and you have to do this bend. There's actually a cable out there. See, I'm just not so thrilled with the way that that looks. Fortunately, I already put this bend in here from the previous build, but again, this is just not something that I really care for. I would like to see more options that come on these newer cases that cater to the placement of that USB 3 header. This is the audio front panel right here. Alright guys, so I got my power switch and LEDs for the front panel connected. I got the USB front connected, the USB 2.0 and the front audio are all connected here at the bottom. Alright, so the next thing we're going to go ahead and do on this build is install the RX 580 graphics card. Alright, this is the Power Color Red Dragon RX 580 8GB model. There's really nothing too special about this card. It has a nice, just simple, clean looking backplate. The cooler shroud is just literally nothing special. 2 good sized fans. No RGB or anything exists on this card. Just a good old 8GB RX 580. So I already have the 2 spacers right here where my finger is. I already have these spacers, or these blank inserts removed. I go ahead and line this video card up. It just kind of pops in there like so. You make sure the tab that's on the back side of it, this tab down here, make sure it's toward the video card, and that the video card is seated all the way. And then you can put 1 or 2 screws in here to hold everything in place. Alright guys, so in order to install the power supply, we are going to first remove this rear power supply bracket. Not all cases have this, but a lot of them do these days. This allows us to mount the power supply to this bracket and then put the whole unit in, and then just fasten it into the chassis with the thumb screws attached. Alright guys, so as I mentioned in the earlier video, we're just going to use a pretty cheap Thermaltake 80 plus white 500 watt power supply. It's nothing special. It's helping us save some money on the build, and it should meet the requirements of the system. If you have more money to spend somewhere, you know, definitely try to get a nicer power supply. But I've used power supplies like this in the past with little to no issues, so we'll see how this one goes. I usually don't get too many Thermaltake power supplies though. I have run some in the past, but you know, I've run a lot of cheap Corsairs and Seasonics and stuff. I actually use more expensive Seasonics in my personal builds. You know, I had larger budgets for those. Not everybody is going to want to buy the 850 watt Seasonics that I have in those. And one of the cost-saving things on this power supply is that it is not modular. It's not even semi-modular. So we do have to deal with some extra wires. But this case does have a fully enclosed power supply shroud. So, you know, yes, these will take up some room, but you're not really going to see them anywhere from the front. So not much of a worry. Alright, so with this power supply, we're going to, you want it face down, because in this case it takes air from the bottom of the case. Facing it up wouldn't really do it any favors. So there is an air intake on this case, and you want to make sure that the fan is facing that. Alright, you want to make sure you use the appropriate screws for the power supply, which in most cases will be the same screws that you use to fasten the motherboard to the case. Alright guys, so we are going to put in the 4 screws. Alright, so it's important that, you know, like anytime you have to put multiple screws in, you usually don't want to tighten them as you put them in. You want to get them all like mostly there. And then once everything's lined up, then you can go ahead and snug these screws up. Alright, now that we have our power supply mounted to the brackets, we are going to go ahead and feed these wires through. Alright guys, and that's all it's to physically getting the power supply in the case. So now we have to go ahead and check out this bundle of wires and see what we need. So we know we need the 24-pin ATX power. So because this is a pretty simple power supply, there really isn't a whole lot of extra wires. So we just have this bundle right here, which I'm going to zip tie up, and then we have this Molex one as well. So we have an extra SATA power and an extra Molex, and both of these are going to get tied up and put out of the way, because these are the only ones we're going to need. We're going to need this 24-pin ATX power. We're going to need this for the GPU, the PCIe power. We are using a SATA SSD, so we are going to need the SATA power, and then this is our EPS power connector. So only 2 that we have to get out of the way. And one thing I noticed about this power supply that I'm not too crazy about is I wish these wires were better covered up. Like, nobody really wants to see all that, so they definitely could have ran this up further like a lot of other power supplies. But what are you going to do? It's a cheap $35 power supply, and it's just what you get when you go cheap. Alright guys, so we're going to go ahead and fasten the solid state drive to the bracket. Alright, we have the solid state attached to our bracket. We're going to connect the SATA cable and the SATA power cable. And those. Alright, so the SSD is installed. Now we just have to take this SATA cable. So this wire right here is the HDMI for the front HDMI panel, and it just passes through the back so that you can plug right into your video card like that. If you're not using a VR headset, you really might not use this for much of anything. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to tie this up here in the back of this case. Alright guys, that about wraps up this video on the mainstream family member AMD build. I hope you guys enjoyed watching me build this system. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and throw those in the comment section below. If you guys enjoyed watching this video, give me a like. If you want to see more from JP Tech, hit subscribe. And until that next video, I'll see you guys around.